Well, I think whenever you have these battles in communities, I think the first layer is that I think citizens look at the form of government and then have to decide, which form of government is better. Is it better to have a single member district? At the time, the business leaders, the establishment leaders, the white leaders in this town did not want single member districts because it would then there would be more minority representation. They wanted to maintain control of the power in the city, and so, as in many communities in the South, and so they wanted and had proposed a 10-4-1. So 10 single member districts, which would, in a 10 single member district scheme, you could not guarantee a Hispanic district. That would be very difficult to get one Hispanic. Their numbers were showing they could, but we knew that it wouldn't do. But then what they would call a quadrant system, where then you would have an overlay of 4 districts, and then the mayor being the one, 10-4-1. Anytime you have an at-large, where all the citizens vote for one or vote in a quadrant, at the expense of a single-member district, you're diluting the representation of minority communities. And, Dallas wasn't this, other communities were going through this battle. And, it's a common thing of attempting, when minorities gain power, to try to go backwards to an at-large system to dilute their voting strength. So, and it was one that it was shocking how hard they fought it. I think the city expended over $3 million in attorney's fees alone, paying out attorney's fees alone at that time. And so, it was appealed and brought back. They fought it so hard that what happened is we hit upon the 1990 census. And those census numbers, once they were released, were, of course, more favorable for the minority communities. So that then gave us more opportunity to where we ended up with the 14-1 system. Now, just in recalling what happened was there was this lawsuit that was ongoing. And then the city passed, the 10-4-1, but it would have to go to the voters to vote upon it. And so there was a campaign. And it's during that campaign, and these are the things I remember that I think were beneficial for so many of us that worked on this case. That we brought the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership representatives that came to train on civil disobedience, because during the campaign there were, knowing that the city was going to vote against the interests of the minority community, then there was that many who then resorted to civil disobedience. And I just remember that there were pictures in Time magazine, and we made national news because there were disruptions of City Hall and many acts of civil disobedience against the council for the actions that they were taking.
Can you give us a little more specifics on that? Were there marches or?
There were. I specifically remember the picture that made Time magazine. It was a few members of the Mexican American Bar, African American leaders as well, that basically put chains. They had chains around their necks in the back, sitting in the back of City Hall, and they stood up. Was one vivid recollection that I have. But they were mostly disruptions of City Hall. We had a march, I remember, in downtown Dallas. In order to make a case, you have to show that the community is divided, and it's divided on racial lines, and that's how people vote, that they vote along racial lines. And so what was interesting, I remember too, like the day after the results of that election, Bill holding up a map, and the map showed.
I'm just checking
Yeah.
to make sure we're still recording. Yep.
Yeah. I just remember the map showing how all of the basically white precincts and districts had voted for 10-4-1, and all the southern part, all the minority order had voted for the single member district. And it was that thing of, you go to court, this election is Exhibit A of, our what we call polarized voting along racial lines. In terms of looking at government, you look at what system is better for a citizen in terms of representation. And I think that there are benefits in both, right? If you have a single member district system, you have to be careful as well, because then it can be that no one is looking at the interests of the city as a whole. You can get very gerrymandered districts to the point that they no longer are communities of interest. They have opposite interests. So I think those are just some areas where you always have to be careful when you are making these districts, and just to make sure that it is a better system of government. I think definitely initially it was extremely positive. People who had been community activists and leaders, were then getting elected to city council. And I think, this work was not just done in Dallas, but in communities throughout Texas. And like I say, my husband literally changed the face of city councils and representative governments all over the state of Texas, where you finally have people of color at the table, maybe not necessarily having the votes to get their way all the time, but their concerns of of who they represent, of the citizens, being heard by the full body. So I definitely think, that initially it was a very positive thing for the city of Dallas. I think sometimes people look at it, and I know with some of the redistricting that happened thereafter, and we had a Hispanic district, we lost that Hispanic district. But I think people need to remember that it's not necessarily the color of the person that's elected. What has to be looked at is, was it the choice of the voters? Was it the choice of the Hispanic community that lived in that district? Because you can see a scenario where Hispanic citizens might make an alliance with some other group in their district and elect a non-Hispanic. So I think that's wow. When we get to that point, that's what we want. That's healthy. That's good. So I think that given the time in Dallas and the history of Dallas, and I think if you look at the history of Dallas, any minorities that we had that served school board, city council, those were not the choice of Hispanic voters. Those were chosen by the business leaders of this community, the white business leaders of this community. So it's tokenism. And that really was the history of, and what Dallas did to avoid, thinking that they could avoid lawsuits. So, I think that's what we have to focus on when we look at these districts and the outcomes. Did the choice of those Hispanic or minority voters, did that take effect? Did that happen? My recollection was that the questions were about I'm pretty sure the questions were about like the organization that I represented at the time, and the fact that the community meetings that we had, and the fact that this was basically the will of Hispanic citizens of Dallas. I do remember that they just asked me about general background and growing up in Dallas, because I remember telling the story of my parents who had moved as young adults from Laredo, where they told me, you know, we suffered poverty, but we never felt in Laredo that we weren't part of dominant culture or dominant society. But when we moved to Dallas, it was shocking for us. My mom, I know, she would be horrified. She was used to shopping in fine stores in Laredo. Didn't see where were all the Hispanic people in certain parts of downtown Dallas, but she remembers seeing signs in restaurants and in stores saying, you know, no dogs or Mexicans allowed. And that was just shocking to her. And so my parents just, I think out of survival, they always worked for the cause and always worked to try to help other Hispanics, to push them to go to school, to get educated. They were very active in the American GI Forum. And so that, I remember telling those stories in court to the judge.
And were you a witness for the defense then, or the plaintiffs, or how did you?
For the plaintiffs, in other words, for the Ledbetter Neighborhood Association.
Okay. So then were you working with or called by Mike and Betsy?
It would have been by Bill Garrett. The city, to explain it to the citizenry, would have meetings all throughout different parts of the city. And there was a group, I forget what they called themselves, but they were basically just a very, I think, race-baiting group, you know, very conservative, fighting against the single-member district plan. And it was interesting just to sit back and watch that they would basically go up there and talk about how horrible single-member district was and give examples and, you know, things happening in other cities where basically the African-American community was happy with the system that they had, but these outside agitators would come in and, you know, now everything's gone to hell. And, you know, they would just rile the people that it was fascinating and horrifying, like a car wreck or something, because you could see it happening and it would repeat itself. And so then by the time it was the time for the citizens to stand up, they could individually go and give input, you would just hear the most outrageous, racist comments. And, you know, of course, here the lawyers were for the plaintiffs taking notes. Because, again, that was evidence for their case. Many people would get up there, because, like, I never forgot some woman, like it was Preston Hollow area. Actually, yeah, she's just like, oh my God, the other day I was at the shopping center, and there was a sighting. That, you know, there was a black man there, and, you know, I mean, just crazy things like that. And so, like, oh my God. And then I remember another person getting up and saying, you know, they took our schools, they took our name, you know, they took, what more do they want? You know, just, again, it was like they would just rile these people up to where they felt free to just say all these things. And I think for me, it was shocking. But then I reflected and I thought how sad that was, but then that was the reality. That was the reality I knew from, you know, hearing my parents and their experiences living in Dallas when they were young adults, and always hoping that things had changed, but knowing that for some there had not been much change. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that now in retrospect and having lived in other communities, Adelpha Callejo, she kind of had that, I think, wisdom of knowing when some of these things would pop up, saying, we need to have the ability to quickly be able to strategize and to meet. So she had what was called the Coalition of Mexican American Organizations or Hispanic organizations, and so it was basically that ability to call the head of MABA, the head of the Hispanic Chamber, and to meet and to say we have this issue. It was ad hoc, and it was again just for, but I think that what happened, and I think it's rare that can happen, but the same thing happened in the African American community, and that we were able to stick together and hold together. And yes, among the activists, the business leaders, it's the Dallas way, again, tokenism. So yes, were there people picked off, or were there people that they picked to be their representatives for the 10-4-1? Yes, I mean, that did happen. But by and large, the majority of the communities held together. And most importantly, there were even those moments where it was, we'll give the African American community a district at the expense of the Hispanic, or we'll cut this neighborhood in, like trying to make deals to get them to go along. And then they tried that with the Hispanic community to basically throw the African Americans under the bus. But that didn't happen. It was really a time when we worked well together, and even when tempted, we held firm. The work that has been done to fight some very racist ideas, or some very racist actions to suppress the minority communities in the city. All that was fought. And it's not to say that it doesn't creep in here and there, but the system's in place now. The opportunity, it's up to the community. It's up to them to vote. It's up to them to show up and vote. And that's, of course, where we still have a lot of work to do. Of course, we know when communities are disenfranchised and don't have a history of voting, it's harder to get them to vote. But I think they need knowing this history, knowing how hard we had to fight. It should give them the passion. It should give them the desire of how important that vote is. If they came out and voted at the same rate as white voters in the city, it would be amazing. We wouldn't be talking about 2 and 3 Hispanic districts, right? Same thing with African American voters. We know that our Hispanic population is a younger population. So you work with total numbers, voting age population. Ours is much higher. So again, you see that the future in terms of our population. But I remember going to speak at high school students, and saying, "Oh, you say the Hispanic population has jumped from this number to this number. Okay, what does that mean?" Well, all it just means is that we're having babies and we have a growing population. But if we don't register to vote, and if we don't actively continue to vote in city, county, school board elections, national elections, what will that mean? It won't mean much. It'll mean that our interests are not represented. So, I think that's probably one of the biggest lessons, I think, in all of this. I decided to run for that. And so I learned then running in a district You can't just rely on your Hispanic voters. You can't just rely on your white voters. You know, you can't just rely on the black voters. You have to look, and that district encompassed parts of West Dallas. It encompassed Winnetka Heights. It's just, right? So it was then that personal lesson for me of, yes, these are districts, single members are easier to run in. I remember I knocked on 900 households in 5 weeks. I walked the district. So, again, that was a big benefit of having a single member district, where those districts become easier for the candidates to get to know the people they're going to represent by walking. And, you know, I won that race overwhelmingly for that reason.